remember that there are four economic classifications of industries. So we have industries that are perfect competition. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the monopoly, the one company industry. Most businesses in the world are monopolistic competition. That means there's lots and lots of these small businesses, but they have differentiated products. There's some non-price competition going on. But every day, we interact with groups of companies where there's a few companies. It's not that there's one, there's two, there's three, there's five, there's 10. A small number where they all know each other and you know all of them. And these companies are called oligopoly, which means a few. And they have very unique ways of doing business, which fascinate us economists and should fascinate you. Okay, a few firms, a few. There's no precise number of firms that you need to be in an oligopoly, right? There's at least two, which is called a duopoly. So there's at least two, but how many airlines are there? How many car companies are there? 15, 20 that total that you could think of? Okay, so it doesn't have to be, two or three or four. It can be more. How we know it's an oligopoly is that they react to each other, and we'll talk about this again in a second. If a sandwich shop on the west side of town changes their prices or starts giving away, free pickles, that doesn't affect sandwich shops 30 miles away on the east side of town. But if United Airlines starts giving away free pickles, or they start charging a fee for this or not a fee for that, or they decide to fly a new route, or they change their price on another route, or whatever they're doing, the other airlines have to pay attention to them. When one car company starts saying, look, 0% interest, no payments for 90 days, pretty soon every car company is having to offer 0 interest and no payment for 90 days. Okay, they have to respond to each other. Oligopoly is like chess or football or some game where you have to pay attention to what your opponent is doing or you're going to lose. Okay? Oligopoly always has strong barriers to entry. In monopoly, to be a monopoly, you have to be able to stop new companies from coming in. Well, occasionally a new car company like Tesla pops up, or occasionally a new airline like Frontier or Spirit pops up. So it's not impossible to get into these industries. It's just very difficult, and it doesn't happen every day. We can go years and decades between new significant companies popping up. Okay? They have ways to prevent new competition. Think about an airline. There's only so many gates at the airport. If every gate at the airport already belongs to one airline, the new company coming in is going to have a tough time because they need to get airport gates so that they can land. Okay? And the other old existing airlines will try to block the new airlines by simply not giving them space to park a plane at a gate. Okay. Concentration. What tells us a lot about how rough this oligopoly is what we call concentration. Concentration is how powerful or how concentrated the leading companies in this industry are. Is this an industry, even though it's an oligopoly and there are 20, are there 3 that dominate and then the rest are just little bitty players? So one way we measure concentration, the old school way, is just something that we called a concentration index. And we would take the top 4, the top 8 companies and add up what percent of the market that those companies held. Okay, that's okay. But in the modern world, we prefer to use this thing called the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And it's actually pretty simple. Okay? We take each business in the industry and we look at what percent of the industry it covers. So if United Airlines has 20% and Southwest has 20% and Delta has 20% and American has 20%, we take each one of those 420s and we square them, we get 400 and 400 and 400 and 400, and those guys, those four companies add up to 1,600, and then we take all the other airlines and we do the same thing for them, and maybe we get 1,800 or 1,900. Okay, that number is used by government to decide whether these industries are too monopolized or not. It gives us an idea of how powerful the big companies in this industry are. Okay, so we take the percentage of the market that each company owns, we square them, and we add them up. Little guys, if you have 1% of the market, you square that, that's a 1. If you have 20% of the market, you square that, that's a 400. So the H index, as it's called, because there's two H guys up there, emphasizes the big companies. It's going to be, if you have one company that has 96% and 3 companies that each have 1%, that's way different than you have 4 companies that each have 25%. And the concentration ratio wouldn't make a difference. It would say, hey, those 4 companies add up to 100. But the H index is going to say that the business that has 96 in 1 and 1 in 3 is way different than the business, the industry, where there's 25% each in 4 companies. Okay? So if we look at Las Vegas, we actually have an H index well over 3,000. There are 2 companies that between them own about 80% of the hotel rooms on the Strip, and they're about the same size. So you have 2 companies that are 40% each. You square that, you get 1,600 each. You add those together and you get 3,200 out of just the first 2 companies. Okay, so again, you got Caesars at about 40%, MGM at about 40%, and those guys have changed the way they do business so that they don't actually own a lot of those properties anymore, but they run them. In other words, they used to own 40% of the Strip, and MGM owned 40% of the Strip. Now Caesars manages 40% of the hotels rooms, and MGM manages those rooms. But they have investors that actually own the hotels now, even though they don't run them. And it's not clear how that affects this whole business, but we'll eventually know. So you've got 40 squared plus 40 squared plus all the other companies squared. And so we're somewhere over 3,200. The government considers that to be very high. And if Caesars and MGM wanted to merge in theory, they would say no. And in fact, the old mergers, we'll talk about this when we get there, they probably shouldn't have allowed them. So there's lots of oligopolies out there, and one of the biggest, most noticeable oligopolies is breakfast cereal, right? There's General Mills, and there's Quaker, and there's Kellogg's, but there aren't a lot of companies that make breakfast cereal. It's an oligopoly, okay? The trick to oligopoly is what we call interdependence. Again, they have to respond to each other. The fact that what one does affects the other is called interdependence. If one breakfast cereal company said, hey, we're going to fill our boxes to the top, and the rest of them kept filling their boxes 2/3 full, people, consumers, would notice, and they'd change their buying behaviors. What one does affects the others. Okay? Some of the 1 or 2 of the cereal companies started changing the sugar view. So there used to be Sugar Smacks and Sugar Pops and blah, blah, blah. And that word sugar is just gone from all the names of all the cereal companies. So one company says, hey, we're going to de-emphasize sugar. We're going to start talking about how healthy our food is. Right? And so Cheerios starts this whole, our cereals are really healthy thing. And all of the other cereal companies have to respond to that and start telling people how healthy their cereal is. So they're interdependent. And again, we really see this in car companies when one car company offers very good financing, 0% financing, no payment for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. Pretty quick, everybody has to do it. And all the car companies are mad at whatever company did it first, but they have to respond. If you're getting a 6% loan from Ford and a 0% loan from General Motors, people stop going to the Ford dealerships because they don't want to pay that 6%. So they have to respond to each other. They're interdependent. All right? This happens over and over again. And that's how you tell something's an oligopoly. If company A changes and company B doesn't, not an oligopoly. If United changes their fares between Vegas and LA, everybody's going to change their fares between Vegas and LA. When Southwest has a sale, everybody else has a sale. All right? People have to respond to each other. They're interdependent. Now, how do we get around that? Because that doesn't sound like fun at all. If you're General Motors, you don't want to have to keep responding to things. The way we get around that is by collusion, by colluding. It's a fancy word for working together. If you go into the breakfast cereal aisles at grocery stores, it doesn't matter what grocery store you're in, the breakfast cereals are arranged the same way. And in fact, the cereal companies help the stores stock the shelves. It saves the store money, and in exchange for that, there's a pattern to how the boxes go up on the shelf. The pattern is consistent across every grocery store. And the government has actually sued the breakfast cereal companies to try to get them to stop colluding. And they can't seem to really win, and they haven't done it in a long time because it's hard for a jury to really believe that collusion among breakfast cereal companies is a big deal. But they collude. They work together. They have what we call tacit collusion. And let me badly write that word out for you. If they wrote down an agreement and that agreement said, this is what we're going to do, that would clearly be illegal. But if there's an unwritten agreement that's just been in place for 50 years and they follow it, that's tacit collusion. And it's pretty hard to stop. Coke and Pepsi have an agreement. It's not written down anywhere. And they would say, oh, no, we don't. But they don't talk about price, right? Coke and Pepsi in their advertisements do not talk about price. They never say, hey, we're going to make Coke cheaper than Pepsi or the other way around. They compete using things other than price. There's a tacit agreement there that Coke and Pepsi follow. Okay? All right. So how do we study oligopoly and their behavior? Well, the answer is we use something called game theory. And game theory started with this dude over here named John von Neumann. He was studying it in the 30s. The government hired him to apply it to military things during World War II. And he and a guy named Oscar Morgenstern write a book that really creates the field. His interest wasn't really in winning World War II. His interest was being a better poker player, and that's why he studied all this, was to play poker. And he actually proved that to win at poker, you have to be able to bluff sometimes. Bluff means that sometimes when you have a bad hand and your cards are really bad, you have to bet a lot and try to win the hand with bad cards. If you don't do that, that means the people playing against you, if they know you're not going to bluff, the people playing against you have an advantage on you. Because if you're betting a lot, they know you have a good hand. And if you're not betting much, they know you have a bad hand. And they can adjust their behavior based on the information you're feeding them about what's in your cards. So you have to uncouple the amount that you're betting from how good your cards are. And the better a job you do that, the more confused your opponents are about what you have, and the more likely you are to win. Okay? Poker players look for tells. They look for some hint, some information that you're feeding your opponents about good hand, bad hand, Okay? How much you have to bet. And he proved this all mathematically, that it's the information flow between the players that's going to determine the outcome, assuming the cards are random and you play for a long time. It's the information flow between the players that's going to determine the outcome, and you want to fool the other players. That's how you win.